Let's talk more broadly about what this could mean for U.S. companies and, of course, the broader economy. For that, we want to bring in Kevin Hassett. He is the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Trump. He's also a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Mr. Hassett, it's great to have you here on Yahoo Finance. Let's just start with what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was saying about this. She was saying that this global tax reform will help the global economy thrive. She went on to say over the weekend she called it significant. She called it unprecedented. What do you think of this idea?
Well, first, I think the headline, which matters a lot for your viewers who care about the macroeconomy and markets, is that this isn't going to happen. Okay, it's just not going to happen. The G7 has no authority over this. That for the EU to do something, then they basically need about unanimity, and there's no way the Irish will ever sign on to the thing. And then, for the U.S., I think that there's a big question whether it would pass too, because if you analyze it, then basically what we're doing is we're giving foreign countries basically a hunting license to get revenue from U.S. firms that they couldn't get before. Because basically, in order to justify putting taxes on a company, the company had to operate in your country. And so we're giving that up, which is giving a whole bunch of revenue to foreign countries for, basically no good reason. You could argue that maybe they're going to get some extra revenue if all this becomes law in the U.S. From the higher global minimum tax because of reduced transfer pricing. But even if that's true, what's going to happen is companies are just going to invert. They're going to move their headquarters to Ireland or some other country that isn't doing this and avoid the U.S. tax. So this is a chase jobs overseas, chase business overseas endeavor. There's been a bipartisan agreement in the past not to basically let Europeans, hold American firms hostage and collect revenue from them in this way. And it's really, I think, not in the American interest to pursue the policy that the Biden administration is right now.
And it's important for us to listen to someone like you. But I got to ask you, it's a two-part question. What good is being among the most powerful nations economically in the world if you can't do something that you think is in your best interest? I mean, you brought up Ireland, 12.5% tax, and they would never go along with this. So what can the United States do?
Right. Well, this is really well established in the economic literature, that if you want to sort of put politics aside and have an optimal tax system, then basically you would have something like a progressive value-added tax. So you would forget it for low-income people, maybe have a higher rate for rich people, but you wouldn't have a corporate tax at all. And so like a sign of either the partisanship or the economic illiteracy of the Biden team is that they're saying they have to stop the race to the bottom. But actually, the optimal corporate tax is zero. And so what's going on is there's a race to the top. There's a race to the optimal. Because what countries are seeing is that if they have, more revenue from value-added taxes, then they grow faster and they outcompete countries that don't. And that process over the last 20, 30 years has moved a huge share of the tax base for European countries to the value-added tax because it's the most efficient tax. And so there's a tax competition going on for sure. And the most efficient countries are winning for sure. But it's a race to the top, not to the bottom, and we shouldn't stop it. It's basically not in our interest. So what the Biden administration is saying is we need to have this really stupid tax. We've got to go back to being the highest corporate tax on earth, and we know that's really going to kill jobs in the U.S. But don't worry, we're going to make everybody else be stupid too. And now the people will go to a G7 meeting and pretend they're going to be stupid, but when push comes to shove, they're not going to engage in the activity that the Bidens are asking them to do. The Biden administration is asking them to do. It's just not going to happen.
So, Kevin, you don't think that there's any chance then that something like this will then get implemented?
If it does, right, then you're looking at a really complicated process where lots of countries have to pass this thing. And then, they're talking about having, a hammer that they could whack countries over the head with if they don't enact a global minimum tax. But those hammers would violate tax treaties that have been negotiated with all those countries. And so we'd have to renegotiate tax treaties. And get those passed into law. It's a 10-year process to do what they're talking about, but it's a 10-year march to a really stupid place, to a global high tax on capital income that reduces labor productivity and wages, just so that the Biden administration can sort of feel virtuous about soaking the rich. There are ways to soak the rich that are completely economically sensible, that don't cause a lot of economic harm, like having a progressive value-added tax. But this is not it. This is just posturing. It's not policy.
I was going to ask you, what are those ways to soak the rich? And you just brought up the value-added tax. Let's turn our attention to that, because I had asked you at the beginning, what can the United States do? What makes you think if the Biden administration couldn't get this through with the current Congress, why would a VAT tax go through?
Oh, I'm not saying they could get the value-added tax through. I'm saying that as an economist, my job is to analyze the economic impact of policy proposals. And the way to think about like how out to lunch this proposal is, if you combine it with their corporate rate proposal, that you guys might recall, we used to talk about this when I was in the White House, that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act cut the corporate rate to 21%, but it broadened the base a lot at the same time. And so that the total net cost of the corporate reduction over 10 years was about $300 billion because there was all this extra revenue from international tax and then a lower rate. It was base broadening, rate reduction. It's what tax reform is. So what the Biden administration is proposing is that they lift the corporate tax relative to today's law by $2 trillion over 10 years. And so if you want to think about it, that means that there's about a $1.7 trillion tax hike relative to the tax code that we inherited from President Obama. And now, when we started talking about the corporate tax reform back in 2017, we reminded everybody that we were the least attractive tax place on earth, and that's why wages were stagnant and jobs were being shipped overseas and so on. And so the really radical and irresponsible proposal from Biden and Secretary Yellen is to have a humongous tax increase relative to what was the highest, most punitive tax on earth when President Trump took office. And so it's just not something that I think has got a chance in a million years of becoming law, because there are a lot of sensible people in the Democratic Party and, of course, the Republican Party that recognize that being the least attractive tax place on earth is not good. Now, if you look at all the people that are moving from New York to Florida and stuff, like even within the U.S., you can see that these high tax rates have a big effect. And what Biden's proposing to do is to lift the tax so high that everybody would want to flee, and then to encourage the places they might flee to lift their taxes too. But the benefit from not doing that is going to be so high for those other countries, because they're going to get the headquarters from our top firms that they're going to pretend that they want to do it, but then they're not going to do it.
Let's talk a little bit more about jobs here in the U.S., because we just got the May jobs report out on Friday. 559,000 jobs added, a step in the right direction, yet we still have millions more to go to get to where we were pre-pandemic. We know we have a number of states ending the enhanced unemployment benefits. From your perspective, though, how big of a help will that be in order of correcting this supply versus demand imbalance that we seem to have in the labor market, and what else needs to be done?
Right. Well, the supply-demand imbalance is really the big story right now. And of course, the effect of having surging demand without surging supply is you get inflation. And if you look at the sort of 12-month inflation rate in the latest CPI report, it's all the way up to around 9%. Over the first almost half of the year, inflation is looking at posting in around 6%, while wage growth is in the threes. And so, basically ordinary folks are seeing their real wages decline because inflation is going up faster than their wages, and that's because supply isn't keeping up with demand. Now, supply isn't keeping up with demand, I think, for two big reasons. On the sort of capital side, we've got President Biden and his team sort of saying all this spooky stuff about how, it's really going to be good for the global economy to raise taxes, humongously relative to the highest tax on earth when President Trump took office, which doesn't make sense. But if you're a corporation, would you really want to have a big capital expansion right now, given that they're threatening you with these punitive tax rates? Well, probably not. And so we'll expect to see an effect of that on capital spending. So we're not getting supply from there. And on labor supply, we are still paying a lot of folks not to work. I don't think that was a big effect last year because they couldn't work because of COVID. But now that we're turning the lights back on again, it's starting to be a big effect.
Kevin?
And then you might say, well, the red states aren't doing that, but the blue states are. So the red states have decided not to plus up unemployment insurance. And that's true. But if you look at the places where in order to have a global economy skyrocket, we need to get a lot of workers back, it's blue states, because their economies have fallen far, far behind the red state economies. And that's where you got to create jobs. And so I think that basically they're killing supply and they're jacking up demand with this massive stimulus. And so you're going to be seeing inflation.
Kevin, you're one of the rare guests that I can't interrupt. I have to ask you real quick, because the producer's saying,
I don't read.
You are, by the way, a headline machine, because I don't want to interrupt you, but I got to ask you, September 6th, when the stimulus payments expire, what do you think? Do you have a prediction as to what happens with this labor market?
Can I ask you a quiz, which will probably not embarrass you in front of all of your fans?
Go and embarrass me. I put my foot in my mouth every day.
But you remember what year the expanded unemployment insurance benefit expired after the financial crisis under President Obama? Remember
I think it was 2015, but the producer was talking to me as you were asking the question.
It was 2014. It was 2014. And so the point is that what's likely to happen is that come September, then people are going to say, oh, those heartless Republicans want to end the expanded benefits for the poor unemployed folks. And then they're going to basically jam through an extension for another year or so. And so I think you're probably looking at a year or two of expanded benefits before it's given up.
Kevin Hassett, always great to speak with you. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us here today. Former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Trump. We hope to have you back